The dirt on her husband's grave had not yet settled when Alice Wells realized she was completely, utterly alone in the world. And that was the moment she turned back and saw the stranger still standing there. The cemetery outside of Caldwell, Kansas, sat on a low hill to the east of town, a humble stretch of ground marked by wooden crosses and a few carved stones that the wind had been quietly working to erase since the settlement first took root in 1872. It was now the autumn of 1878, and the plains grass had gone the color of old honey, bending in the same long, slow waves it always did when October arrived, and the sky turned that particular shade of pale blue that felt more like loneliness than beauty. Alice had stood at the edge of the open grave while Reverend Moss spoke the words, had held her hands clasped in front of her with her knuckles white beneath her black cotton gloves, and had not cried. She had wanted to cry. She had believed, the night before when she lay in the too-wide bed listening to the wind comb through the eaves of the farmhouse, that the crying would come at the grave. But it had not come. Instead, she felt hollow in a way that she had no name for, as though her husband Thomas Wells had taken something out of her when he went, some essential weight that had kept her rooted to the earth. Thomas had been 41 years old, which was not young, but it was not old either, not out here where men burned through themselves like kindling. He had died of a fever that swept through the county in a matter of 2 terrible weeks, the same fever that had taken the Hawthorne boy and old Marta Siegler, and 2 of the Comanche Creek farmhands whose names Alice was ashamed to admit she had never properly learned. Thomas had gone to bed one Thursday evening complaining of a chill and had been gone by the following Sunday, and the whole terrifying speed of it still lived in Alice's body as a kind of trembling disbelief. She was 29 years old and she was a widow, and the farmhouse sat on 60 acres of Kansas plains that she did not know how to work alone. The funeral had drawn a modest crowd, as funerals did in Caldwell. There was Reverend Moss and his wife, plump and kind-faced Dorothea Moss, who kept pressing Alice's arm with her gloved fingers as though she were testing bread dough. There was neighbor Harlan Price from the farm to the north, who had always feuded with Thomas over the placement of the fence line, and who came to the funeral anyway, because it was the right thing to do in a place where the distances between people were too great to waste time on grudges past the grave. There was Mr. Atwood from the general store and Cora Finch, who ran the boarding house, and 3 or 4 other faces that Alice recognized in the way you recognize the furniture in a room you rarely use. They came, they listened to the Reverend speak, they watched the pine box go down, and then they began to drift away in pairs and small clusters, making their slow separate journeys back toward town or toward their wagons at the gate. Alice accepted the condolences in the order they were offered. She nodded and said thank you and shook hands and let Dorothea Moss hold her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she meant every gracious word she spoke because these people had come, and that mattered. But when the last of them had paid their respects and turned away, and when even Reverend Moss had given her a final solemn look and walked off with his wife, Alice found herself standing alone beside the mound of freshly turned dark earth with the 2 gravediggers who had been waiting at a respectful distance and who now moved forward to finish the work. She watched them for a moment, these 2 quiet men with their tools and their matter-of-fact relationship with death, and then she realized she could not stand there and watch the last shovels of earth go over Thomas, because something in her would not survive it. She turned and began walking toward the low iron gate that marked the cemetery's western boundary, the gate through which all the other mourners had already departed. The October grass crunched softly under her boots. The wind lifted the edges of her black bonnet ribbon and let them fall. She was perhaps 30 yards from the gate, maybe a little less, when something made her look back over her shoulder. She did not know what made her look. Perhaps it was the simple human instinct toward the thing you are trying to leave behind. Perhaps it was some small sound that registered below the level of conscious hearing. Whatever it was, she looked back at the grave and she saw him. He was standing on the far side of the burial mound, at a respectful distance from the gravediggers but clearly in no hurry to leave. He was tall and lean in the way that men who spent their lives outdoors tended to be, the kind of lean that was not gauntness but efficiency, every inch of him shaped by necessity rather than luxury. He wore a dark coat that had seen considerable use, and a hat the color of weathered oak that he was holding in both hands, brim down, with a kind of deliberate formality that struck her as different from the performative grief she had seen from some of the others earlier. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the grave, and there was something in the set of his shoulders and the particular stillness of his posture that told her he had been standing there for a while, long enough to outlast everyone else, long enough that his presence was now the most significant thing in the entire cemetery. Alice stopped walking. She stood there with the gate perhaps 15 feet behind her and stared at this man she did not recognize, this stranger who had come to her husband's funeral and stayed when all the others had gone, who stood with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the grave with a gravity that seemed entirely genuine and not the least bit performed. She did not recognize him. She was quite certain of that. She had lived in Caldwell and on the surrounding land for 4 years since coming out from Ohio with Thomas, and she knew most of the faces in the county even if she did not know all the names attached to them, and this face she had never seen. He was perhaps 30, or perhaps a few years past it, with the kind of face that the plain sun worked on in ways that made precise age difficult to assign. The gravediggers continued their work. The sound of the shovels was very clear in the quiet air. The man with the hat in his hands did not move. Alice turned all the way around so she was facing back toward the grave. She was not sure why. Something would not let her simply walk through the gate and drive the wagon back to the farmhouse. Something in that solitary figure standing over Thomas's grave demanded, if not explanation, then at least acknowledgement. She walked back. She walked back across the crunching grass and the uneven ground, past the older graves with their worn markers, and stopped a few feet from the stranger. Up close he was even taller than she had judged from a distance, and his face was indeed the kind that the sun had been having a long conversation with. There were lines at the corners of his dark eyes, deep ones, and a jaw that carried the shadow of several days of stubble, and his hands around the hat brim were large and scarred in the particular way that working hands always were. He had not looked up when she approached. He looked up now. His eyes were a very dark brown, almost black, and there was something in them that Alice found difficult to identify in the first moment. It was not pity, which she had been receiving in quantities that were beginning to feel like a second grief. It was not the awkward condolence look that most people wore like an ill-fitting coat. It was something closer to understanding, and it was direct in a way that was not rude, but was also not performing anything for her benefit. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, shaped by the South somewhere, Georgia or perhaps the Carolinas, far enough east that it retained a certain roundness that the plains seemed to strip out of voices over time. "I ought to have come to speak to you earlier, before the service ended, but I did not want to intrude on the others paying their respects." Alice looked at him for a moment in which she tried to locate his face somewhere in her memory and failed again. "Did you know my husband?" she asked. "I did," he said. "Not well and not recently, but I did know him." He paused, and something moved through his expression that she could not quite read. "My name is Clement Ashford. I passed through Caldwell some years back before you were here, I imagine, and Thomas Wells helped me in a way that I never properly thanked him for. I only heard about his passing last week, through a man in Wichita. I wanted to come." Alice absorbed this. A man who had come from Wichita for a funeral, for a debt of gratitude he felt he owed to a man who was already past receiving it. She looked at him for a long moment in the pale autumn light, and something inside her that had been pulled tight since Thomas went into the ground relaxed by the smallest possible amount. "What did he do?" she asked. "Thomas, what was it he helped you with?" Clement Ashford looked at the grave again, and she could see that the question touched something real in him. "The winter of '73, he said. "I came through here on my way north and my horse went lame 2 miles out of town. It was cold, the kind of cold that this country does that you don't believe until it's happening to you. Your husband was the first man I encountered on the road. He took me in, gave me a bed and a hot meal and would not hear of payment. Put my horse up in his barn for a week until she was sound enough to travel." He paused again. He was that kind of man. Alice felt the hollow place inside her do something complicated and painful. "Yes," she said quietly. "He was exactly that kind of man." They stood together in silence for a moment, the two of them, and the sound of the shovels and the October wind, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that forms naturally between two people who are both in the presence of something that demands acknowledgement and cannot be rushed. "You did not come in with the others," Alice said, not as an accusation, just as an observation she was trying to make sense of. "I arrived late," he said. "I rode hard from Wichita, but I miscalculated the distance. By the time I reached the cemetery, the service was already beginning, and I did not want to disrupt it." He turned his hat over in his hands, a small motion that she would come to recognize as characteristic of him in moments when he was feeling something he was choosing his words carefully about. "I stood at the back. I did not see you." "No," he said. "You were not looking for anyone." He said it without any implication, just as a statement of fact, and it was accurate. Alice had stood at that grave looking at nothing but the pine box and the dark Kansas earth. The gravediggers were finishing. The last of the soil was being tamped down with the flat of a shovel. Alice realized she had stayed long enough to witness what she had originally turned away from, but with this stranger beside her it had felt manageable in a way it would not have felt alone. She was not sure what to do with that recognition. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "After Caldwell." Clement Ashford looked at her, and there was something in the look that hesitated. "I have not determined that yet," he said. She should not ask a man she had met 10 minutes ago at her husband's graveside to come to her farmhouse for a meal. She knew this. And yet the farmhouse was where she was going, and the farmhouse was where she would be completely alone this evening for the first time in 4 years. And this man had ridden from Wichita because Thomas had been kind to him once in a hard winter, and Thomas being honored that way felt like something she ought to acknowledge in return. "The least I can do," she said, hearing the slight formal stiffness in her own voice and not knowing how to remove it, "is offer you supper, for coming this distance." He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment she noticed that his expression did not move toward the presumptuous or the eager in any way that would have made her regret the offer. "That is very kind," he said quietly, "but I don't want to be a burden to you on a day like today." "You have ridden from Wichita," she said, "to honor a man who deserved honoring. That is not a burden I would turn from the door." The corners of his mouth moved, not quite into a smile but into the suggestion of one, the faintest softening. "Then I accept," he said. "Thank you, Mrs. Wells." They walked out of the cemetery together, through the iron gate that swung with a soft groan on its hinges, and onto the road where Alice's wagon stood with her 2 sorrel mares patient in the traces, and where Clement Ashford's horse, a bay with a white sock on the left foreleg, was hitched to the fence post. He mounted and rode alongside the wagon at an easy pace as Alice took up the reins, and neither of them spoke very much on the way to the farmhouse, but it was not the silence of 2 strangers who have run out of things to say. It was something else. It was the silence of 2 people learning the particular rhythm of the other's company. The farmhouse was a solid structure that Thomas had spent 3 years improving from the original claim shack, with a real porch and glass windows, and a kitchen that was the best room in the house because Alice had made it so. Clement Ashford hitched his horse at the post and waited on the porch while she went inside and put wood in the stove, and then she opened the door and told him to come in, and he took off his hat and set it on the hook by the door with the natural ease of a man who knew how houses worked and did not need to be told the small protocols. She made coffee and what she had in the house, which was biscuits and cold sliced ham and some preserved plums from the jar she had put up in August, and she set it all out on the kitchen table, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight because the afternoon had slid toward evening while they were at the cemetery. "Tell me about the work you do," she said. "Are you a rancher?" "A hired hand," he said. "I go where there is work to do, and when it is done I move on." He said it without apology or embarrassment, just as a man stating the shape of his life. "I have been with a cattle outfit in the Nations for the past 2 years, but that work wound up in September. And before that, other ranches. I can mend fence and break horses, and I'm a passable cook when the alternative is going hungry." The suggestion of a smile again. "I served in the war before any of that. Confederate side, though I was 17 and did not understand what I was serving, and I have had a number of years since to think carefully about that." He said this looking directly at her, not evasively, and she recognized it as the kind of honest thing that some men said and some men carried silently into their graves. She respected the saying of it. "I see," she said. She had known men on both sides and had her own views, but this was not the moment for them, and she recognized in his candor not a request for absolution, but simply the kind of honesty that he seemed to extend as a matter of habit. "And you," he said, "you said you were from Ohio. How did you know that?" "Your husband mentioned it the year I stayed. He said he had a girl in Ohio he was going to send for as soon as the farm was worth sending for." Alice felt that strike her somewhere tender. "He did not tell me that," she said softly, "that he talked about me before I came." "He spoke about you with a great deal of warmth," Clement said. "He had a photograph. He showed it to me." She looked down at her coffee cup for a moment. The lamplight moved. Outside, the wind had picked up and she could hear it working the dry grass against the south wall of the house. "I came out in '74, she said. "We had 4 years. She paused. "I keep thinking 4 years is not enough. And then I think that some people have less, and then I feel ungrateful, and then I think that gratitude is not quite the right way to measure grief anyway." "No," he said, "I don't think it is." They sat with that for a moment, and it settled between them like something real and solid. He left that evening before it was full dark, because it was the appropriate thing to do, and because she could see that he was the kind of man who would always know the appropriate thing even when he might prefer something else. He thanked her for the meal with a sincerity that was not excessive and not insufficient, just exactly the right amount, and he put on his hat and untied his horse, and said he would be staying the night at the Finch boarding house in town. "Will you be leaving in the morning?" she asked from the porch. He looked up at her from the yard. The first stars were beginning to show above the flat horizon to the east, small and cold and very clear. "I have not yet decided," he said again, and this time the repetition of the phrase held something different, or perhaps she only heard it differently. She went inside and closed the door and stood in the kitchen with the lamp burning low and the sound of his horse's hoofbeats fading down the road toward town. And she stood there for a long time thinking about a man who had ridden from Wichita to stand at a grave long after everyone else had gone home. She did not sleep well that night, but that was not because of Clement Ashford. It was because of the silence of the house, which had a new quality now, a permanent quality, the silence of a house that had only one person in it and knew this, and was making no pretense otherwise. She lay in the dark and thought about Thomas, the good things which were numerous and real, the way he laughed at his own jokes a half-second before he finished telling them, and the way he smelled of cedar shavings in the evenings after working in the barn, and the absolute reliability of his character, the bedrock steadiness of him. She cried, finally, in that dark house with the October wind outside, and it was the crying she had been waiting for at the grave, the kind that comes from the deepest and most private chambers of the self. In the morning she got up and dressed and ate and went out to see to the horses and the 2 milk cows and the dozen chickens that required attention regardless of grief or weather or the state of her interior world. The farm ran on the rhythms of the animals and the land, and these rhythms did not pause for widowhood, and in a way she was grateful for that, for the brute fact of necessity that kept her moving through the hours. Harlan Price came by mid-morning with his hired man, a taciturn Mexican by the name of Diego, and they offered to help with the harvesting of what was left of the corn in the east field. Alice accepted, because Thomas had always settled disputes with Harlan through work and goodwill rather than through legal proceedings, and she intended to honor that legacy. She made them lunch at noon, cornbread and dried bean soup, and while they sat at the table, Harlan looked at his bowl and cleared his throat and said the thing she had been expecting. "You'll have to make some decisions, Alice, about the farm." "I know that," she said. "A woman alone on 60 acres. "I know what 60 acres is, Harlan," she said, and her voice was level but had something in it that made him stop and look up at her. "Thomas worked this land and he knew every inch of it, and so do I. I am not going to be making any rash decisions." Harlan nodded, having the wisdom to let it rest. Diego ate his cornbread and said nothing, which Alice appreciated. In the afternoon, after they had gone, she was hanging the wet laundry on the line beside the house when she heard a horse on the road and looked up and saw Clement Ashford riding up the track from the main road at a walk, his bay horse moving with the easy long-strided gait of a well-rested animal. She watched him come. He saw her watching and raised his hand in greeting but did not hurry his horse, and when he reached the yard he dismounted and hitched the bay to the fence post and walked over to where she stood with a wet shirt in her hands. "Good morning," he said. "Or afternoon, I suppose." "Afternoon," she confirmed. "You are still here." "I am still here," he said, and there was something in his eyes, that particular quality of directness combined with a kind of careful restraint, that she was beginning to understand as fundamental to him rather than situational. "I wondered if I could be of use. I noticed yesterday that the north pasture fence has several posts that have heeled over. It will not hold cattle through a hard winter." Alice looked at him. She looked at this man who had come to her husband's funeral from a day's ride away, and had stayed to stand over the grave and had come back the next morning offering to mend her fence, and she searched very carefully for the transaction in it, the angle or the expectation or the presumption, and she could not find any of those things. What she found instead was something that looked remarkably like simple decency, and simple decency out here was not a simple thing. "I would appreciate that," she said. "The tools are in the barn." He spent that day, and the next 3 days working on the various things the farm needed that Thomas had been planning to address before the fever took him. He mended the north pasture fence, and he repaired the hinge on the barn door that had been pulling loose from the frame, and he cut and stacked a considerable pile of firewood from the cottonwood deadfall down by the creek that Thomas had been meaning to get to since August. He worked with the methodical efficiency of a man long accustomed to working alone, not requiring direction or supervision, not underfoot, simply present and useful in the way that only certain kinds of people knew how to be. In the evenings Alice would call him in for supper, and they would sit at the kitchen table and talk, really talk, in the way that she had not talked to anyone in a very long time, perhaps in years, perhaps since before Thomas's illness had begun to take the conversational energy out of their evenings. Clement Ashford was not a man who talked for the sake of talking, but when he talked he meant it, and he had a way of listening that made you feel that what you were saying mattered to him, not as entertainment, but as information about the world and the person in it that he genuinely wanted to have. She learned about him in fragments over those evenings, the way you learn about a person when neither of you is in a hurry and neither of you is performing for the other. He had grown up in Georgia, the son of a tobacco farmer, the eldest of 5 children. The war had taken him at 17 and returned him at 20, and the farm he came back to was not the farm he had left, and the world was not the world he had left, and he had spent the years since moving west in stages as so many of them had, looking for something or running from something or both, which he said with the kind of self-aware wryness that Alice found to be one of the most appealing things about him. He had never been married. He said this not defensively but simply as a fact. "I have not been in one place long enough," he said, "and I have not found the reason to stop." Alice noted the past tense. She did not remark on it. She poured more coffee and asked him about the cattle country in the nations, and he described it with the kind of specific sensory detail that she realized was rare. The smell of the red earth, and the sound of the cattle drives moving through the blue twilight, and the way the sky in the territory was different from the sky in Kansas, whiter somehow and more merciless, and she sat across from him in her kitchen with her hands around her coffee cup and listened and felt, for the first time since Thomas died, something other than grief and hollow uncertainty. She was not falling in love with this man. She was very clear with herself about this, in the way that newly widowed women sometimes have to be very clear with themselves about such things. She was grateful for his presence, and she was enjoying his company, and that was appropriate and sufficient. On the fifth day he came to her after breakfast with his hat in his hands, which she now knew meant something careful was coming, and he said that he thought the major repairs were done, and that he ought to be moving on. She did not want him to go. This feeling arrived with a clarity and a force that surprised her, and she stood in her kitchen doorway and felt it very plainly and honestly, which was her way of dealing with feelings that she was not sure she was supposed to have. "Where will you go?" she asked. "South, I think, Texas. There is always work in Texas." "There is work here," she said, and then the rest of it before she could consider the wisdom of it too carefully. "I cannot run this farm alone, Clement. I have been trying to think through how to manage it, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion, which is that I need help, and you need work. And this farm is a good farm with good land if it is properly worked. I am not asking for charity." She said this last with a firmness that was not aimed at him, but at the part of herself that she needed to be very certain about. "I am asking you to consider an arrangement. Fair wages and a bed in the bunkroom off the barn, as long as the work is here." He looked at her for a long time, and the October light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them, and she held his gaze because she meant what she had said, and she wanted him to know that she knew what she was saying. "I am not a man who collects wages from people who cannot afford to pay them," he said. "I can afford to pay you," she said. "The farm is clear of debt and Thomas kept careful accounts. I have enough to get through the winter and through the next harvest if I am careful. After that, if the farm is producing, I will be in a sound position." She paused. "I have looked at those accounts very carefully." He turned the hat brim in his hands, once around, twice. "All right," he said at last. "Through the winter, we will see after that." Through the winter, she thought, all right. The weeks that followed were a kind of education for both of them. The education that happens when two people begin to share the rhythms of days in a place they both have reason to care about. Alice was a capable and intelligent woman with a farmer's practical knowledge of what the land needed and a housewife's deep experience of the 1,000 small operations that kept a household running. But there were aspects of the farm's heavier work that she had always relied on Thomas for, and Clement stepped into those spaces with a natural competence that she found herself grateful for daily. He did not take over. That was the thing she noticed most. He helped. He contributed. He always checked with her before making any decision about the farm that was not purely about the maintenance of his own assigned tasks. And this habit of asking rather than assuming, of treating her as the authority on her own land, moved her in ways she was not fully prepared for. November came in cold and gray, the first hard frosts arriving in the second week, and Alice brought out the heavy quilts and put extra wood beside the kitchen stove, and made a batch of apple butter from the last of the barrel apples, filling the kitchen with a sweetness that felt like a small protest against the coming cold. Clement came in from the barn one evening with his coat ice-crusted at the collar, and she made him sit by the stove and poured him coffee and watched him thaw out by degrees and thought, not for the first time and with increasing clarity, that she was in some difficulty with regard to her feelings about this man. The thing was that she was not confused about it. She was clear-eyed enough to know exactly what was happening. She was a 29-year-old widow 2 months from her husband's death, and she was developing feelings for a man who had come out of nowhere and stayed, and any sensible person would have counseled her to wait, to grieve properly, to not trust the warmth of gratitude for compound attraction. She told herself these things. She told herself these things rather often, in fact, usually late at night when the house was quiet, and she was being most honest with herself. But there were things that made self-counsel difficult. There was the way he listened to her when she talked, that quality of full attention she had already noted. There was the way he was with the animals, patient and consistent, never cruel, earning their trust rather than demanding it. There was the evening he found her sitting at the kitchen table with Thomas's account books spread out around her, and a pencil in her hand and tears on her face. Not the weeping kind of tears, but the quiet, steady kind that come from exhaustion and worry. And he had not said anything falsely reassuring. He had simply pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and said, "Tell me what you are working through." And she had told him, all of it, the numbers and the worries and the harvest calculations and the spring planting costs, and he had sat with her for 2 hours and worked through it with her. And when they had finished, the numbers showed that it was manageable, genuinely manageable, and she had felt something release in her chest that she had not known was clenched. He was also, she was acutely aware, very easy to look at. This was not something she was proud of noticing about a man hired to work her farm, but she was an honest woman and she noticed it. He moved through the world with a kind of unhurried physical ease that drew the eye whether you wanted it drawn or not, and there was a quality to his face in those unguarded moments when he did not know she was watching, a thoughtfulness, an inner life behind the eyes, that was more attractive to her than any purely physical feature. She did not act on any of it. The distance between what she felt and what she permitted herself to express was wide and firmly maintained. She was polite and warm, and they talked in the evenings, and she was honest with him in all the ways that mattered. But she was a woman who had been raised to know what was proper and to act accordingly, and she acted accordingly. Clement, for his part, was not obtuse about it. He was a man who had spent a great many years reading situations and landscapes and people, and he was quite capable of reading Alice Wells. He was also quite capable of reading himself, which was more uncomfortable in some ways. He had not expected this. He had come to Caldwell to pay a debt of honor to a dead man, and had been offered a meal by the dead man's widow, and had found himself still here 2 months later. And the reason he was still here was partly the fence and the firewood and the legitimate work that a farm in autumn requires, and partly something else entirely, something that had its center in the kitchen of that farmhouse, and in the woman who moved through it with the kind of quiet dignity that he found, frankly, almost unbearable in its effect on him. He had been careful. He was always careful because the situation demanded it, and because she demanded it by virtue of who she was. But he was not someone who was comfortable with dishonesty in his own interior. And by November, he had been honest with himself about the fact that he was in love with Alice Wells, which was a fact that seemed at the moment to have nowhere particularly to go, and which he therefore carried quietly and paid no particular outward attention to. December arrived with a serious snowstorm that came out of the north on a Tuesday, and laid 18 inches across the county in 2 days, and made the farm a small, self-contained world bounded on all sides by white. Clement moved from the bunkroom into the house during the storm at Alice's practical insistence, because the bunkroom stove was inadequate against the kind of cold that came with 18 inches of snow, and there was no sense in a man freezing to death out of propriety. He slept in the small room off the kitchen that had been used as a storeroom, and she cleared it out and put a cot in it and a proper quilt, and he thanked her for it with the careful formality that he tended to use when he was most acutely aware of the delicacy of things. On the second night of the storm, with the wind screaming off the plains and the house groaning and holding, they sat on opposite sides of the kitchen fire, and Alice read aloud from the one novel she had, a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch that had traveled with her from Ohio, and Clement listened with his long legs stretched toward the fire and his eyes half closed. And after a while she looked up from the page and found him looking at her with an expression that was unguarded in a way she had not seen before. She stopped reading, he looked away, he looked at the fire. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I was not." He stopped. He was not a man who began sentences he could not finish, and he did not finish that one because she could see him reconsidering. "Do not apologize," she said. She set the book in her lap. The fire crackled. The wind was enormous outside. "Clement," he looked at her again. "I need you to be honest with me," she said, "about what you are thinking. Because I am trying very hard to be sensible and proper, and I think I am managing it adequately. But I find it considerably easier to manage when I know what the situation actually is." He was quiet for a moment that felt very long. "The situation," he said, "is that I have no right to have the thoughts I am having about you, and I know this, and I intend to continue to conduct myself accordingly. I was hired to work this farm, and I will work it honestly and well, and I will not make you uncomfortable by—" "That is not what I asked," she said. "The fire, the wind, the creak of the house." "No," he said, "it is not." He turned the look on her fully, without the careful restraint she had come to expect as his default setting, and it was a look of such plain and unadorned feeling that she felt it go through her like a sound. "Alice, you know what the situation is. You are a great deal more perceptive than you let on, and you have known for some time." She had known. She sat with the admission of it, and with the knowledge of how she felt in return, and with the full weight of the 2 months since Thomas's grave, and she was honest with herself and with him about all of it. "It is too soon," she said. "By any measure that any person in this county would accept, it is far too soon. Thomas has been gone less than 3 months, and you came to his funeral, and now you are working his farm, and I am sitting here in my kitchen with feelings that she stopped. "I know," he said. "I am not going to pretend otherwise," she said. "But I need more time. I need the winter at least. I need to grieve properly, and I need to be certain that what I feel is what I think it is, and not just gratitude, or loneliness, or the warmth of a fire in a snowstorm." "I know," he said again, and the thing that she trusted about him more than almost anything was that there was no frustration in it, no pressure, no sense of anything but genuine and patient acceptance of her terms. "I am not going anywhere." "All right," she said. She picked up the book. "Then I will read to you." He settled back in his chair, and she found her place, and the fire and the wind and the words of George Eliot's extraordinary novel filled the room. And beneath all of it something had changed that could not be unchanged, which was simply the open acknowledgment between two honest people of what was true. The winter was long, as Kansas winters were, but it was not unpleasant, at least not in the farmhouse where the stove kept the kitchen warm and the woodpile that Clement had been building, since October proved to be exactly sufficient. They fell into a domesticity that was not the domesticity of a married couple because it was careful and boundaried, and they were both attentive to those boundaries, but it was a genuine domesticity of shared life, of people who knew each other's habits and accommodated them without discussion, of the small daily exchanges that build the substance of human closeness. Alice talked more than she had talked to anyone in years, she realized. Clement was the kind of listener who made talking feel worthwhile. And Clement laughed more than he had laughed in a very long time, because Alice was quietly and unexpectedly funny in that dry Ohio way, a wit that showed itself in the margins of ordinary conversation, and that he found perpetually delightful. In January, Harlan Price came by and found Clement in the yard, and Alice watched from the kitchen window as the two men talked, and she watched Harlan's expression cycle through several registrations of the situation and arrive at something that she would describe as cautious approval. Harlan had the innate pragmatism of all Plains farmers, and what he saw in Clement Ashford was a man who worked hard and kept the Wells farm in good order and treated Alice with respect. And whatever his private views about the propriety of the arrangement, His pragmatic farmer's mind could not argue with the evidence of a well-maintained farm. Dorothea Moss came by in February with a basket of preserved goods and the transparent pretense of a social call, and sat in the kitchen and looked at Clement's coat on the hook by the door with an expression that telegraphed everything she was too polite to say. Alice served her coffee and dried apple cake and let Dorothea be tactfully indirect about it for 20 minutes before she said, "He is a hired hand, Dorothea, not a companion. He works the farm. He sleeps in the storeroom. Everything is entirely proper." "Of course it is," Dorothea said, in the tone of a woman who was prepared to believe this but thought the territory needed watching. "He seems a very capable man." "He is an extraordinarily capable man," Alice said, and the firmness with which she said it made Dorothea look at her sharply. "Alice," she said, more gently than she had been saying anything else, "I only want what is best for you." "I know you do," Alice said. And then, because Dorothea was genuinely kind and had known Thomas and had held her at the grave, "Give me the spring, Dorothea. I know what I am doing." Dorothea looked at her for a long moment with the eyes of a woman who had her own history and her own understanding of the heart's complicated timetables. "All right," she said. "The spring." March came in with mud and the smell of the earth beginning to wake, and the horses restless in the barn, and Alice, standing in the kitchen doorway one morning, watching the last of the snow go to water in the yard, feeling something shift in herself that she had been waiting to feel since October, some turning, some readiness. She stood there for a long time in the cool, bright morning air and thought about Thomas, really thought about him, not the grief of losing him but the wholeness of him, the real person she had loved and been married to and who was now part of the good black Kansas earth. And she said goodbye to him, not out loud, but in the way that truly matters, in the interior place where your most honest self speaks its most honest words. And she felt the goodbye land and hold and begin to do the work that goodbyes need to do. She was ready. She was not rushing, and she was not being swept away by a snowstorm or a moment of loneliness. She was ready. Clement was in the barn that morning, working on the harness that needed oiling before the spring plowing could begin. She walked across the yard with the mud sucking at her boots and the light very clear and gold on the last patches of snow, and she pushed open the barn door and went in and found him on the milking stool with the harness across his knees and the smell of leather and horse and oil around him. He looked up. She stood in the barn doorway with the morning light behind her, and she said, "The winter is over." He put down the harness. He looked at her with that look she had no longer any reason to look away from, and she did not look away from it. "Alice," he said, and the way he said her name, with exactly the right amount of everything in it, undid something inside her very simply and completely. She crossed the barn and she sat down on the wooden box next to his milking stool, and she took his large scarred hands in both of hers, and she felt him go absolutely still in the way that some people do when something they have been waiting for arrives, and they are afraid that any movement will dissolve it. "I need you to understand that I love Thomas," she said, "genuinely and truly, and I am not replacing him or erasing him. He was a good man, and what I had with him was real, and I will carry it for the rest of my life." "I know that," Clement said. "I would never wish otherwise." "I also need you to understand," she said, "that what I feel for you is its own thing. It is not consolation. It is not loneliness. I have thought about it very carefully all winter, and I know what it is." She looked up at him. "I love you, Clement. I have loved you for a while. I have been waiting to be sure, and I am sure." He brought her hands up to his mouth and held them there for a long moment, and she felt the warmth of it through her fingers and up her arms and into her chest. And when he lowered their joined hands and looked at her, there was a shine in his dark eyes that she had not seen before and that she understood completely. "Alice Wells," he said, "I have loved you since the day I found you walking back across that cemetery to ask a stranger why he was standing at your husband's grave. I have loved every part of you since that day. The way you read Middlemark out loud, the way you do arithmetic in the margins of account books, The way you talk to the mares in the morning like they are people who will have opinions about the weather." His voice was not quite steady. "I am not a man with a great deal to offer. I have a good horse and I know how to work hard, and I will be honest with you until I die. But I would like very much to spend the rest of my life on this farm with you, if you will have me." "I will have you," she said, simply, completely. He leaned forward and kissed her, and it was the kind of first kiss that does not feel like a beginning, because it feels, paradoxically, like the resolution of something that has been building for a long time. And she kissed him back with her whole self. There in the hay-smelling barn, with the March light falling through the slats and the horses shifting in their stalls, and the Kansas plains stretching out in every direction around them, as though the whole flat world had been holding its breath, and had now decided to exhale. Spring arrived in full earnest 2 weeks later, and with it the plowing and the planting, and Alice and Clement worked the 60 acres together with a kind of joyful efficiency that the neighbors noticed and remarked on. Harlan Price, watching them work the east field one afternoon from the road, told his hired man Diego that it was about the most sense he had seen made of that farm since old Thomas was in his prime, and Diego nodded and said nothing because he was a man of excellent judgment about what required comment and what did not. Reverend Moss came to call in April and sat in the kitchen with a cup of Alice's very good coffee and a piece of her dried cherry pie, and had the kind of conversation that Reverend Moss was exceptionally practiced at having, the conversation that was ostensibly about the spiritual health of a parishioner, but was actually about the pastor's pastoral concern for the social and moral arrangements of his congregation. Alice answered his unasked questions with the direct tranquility of a woman who had done nothing she was ashamed of, and had no intention of apologizing for what she was feeling. "We will be married," she said, at the point where saying it out loud felt more efficient than continuing to negotiate around it. "When the spring planting is done and there is a proper moment for it, I would be honored to have you perform the ceremony, Reverend." Moss looked at Clement, who was sitting beside Alice at the table with the exact upright quietness of a man presenting himself for inspection and knowing it and being entirely comfortable with the knowledge. "You are a man of faith, Mr. Ashford." "I am a man who has seen enough of this world," Clement said, "to have arrived at a deep and abiding respect for whatever it is that makes it the way it is. Whether that meets your requirements for faith I cannot say, but I can tell you that I will treat Alice with the full extent of my capacity for care and honesty, and that I intend this marriage with everything that I have." Moss looked at him for a long moment in the way that clergymen do when they are assessing the authentic against the performed, and then he nodded slowly. "I will be honored to officiate," he said. The wedding took place on the 15th of May, 1879, on a Saturday morning that was everything a Kansas spring day could be, warm and brilliant and smelling of the alfalfa that had just come in, and the apple blossoms on the 2 trees at the side of the house that Thomas had planted in hope and Alice had tended in habit, and that now stood in full white bloom as though they had been consulted about the occasion and had dressed accordingly. Dorothea Moss wept openly and without embarrassment, which Alice found to be one of the most genuinely touching things about the whole affair. Harlan Price stood in the small gathering with his hat in his hand and his expression of a man who was prepared to be moved, but was maintaining his dignity about it. Diego stood beside Harlan and looked at the apple trees with the expression of a man who found beauty where he found it and was not required to announce it. Alice wore the best dress she owned, which was not black and which was not white, but was a deep blue that Thomas had once told her was the exact color of the sky an hour after sunset, and which she had kept carefully at the back of the wardrobe because there had been very little occasion for it since she arrived in Kansas. She had pressed it the night before and pinned her hair up with the 2 pearl-headed pins that had belonged to her mother, and when she came out of the bedroom and into the kitchen where Clement was waiting, she saw his face change in a way that made all the trouble of the dress and the hair entirely worthwhile. Clement had gone to the barber in Caldwell the day before and had acquired a new coat from the dry goods section of Mr. Atwood's general store, a dark charcoal wool that fit him better than anything she had seen him wear, and he stood in her kitchen looking like a man who had decided to be entirely present in his own life. And when he saw her, he stood up straight, and his whole expression went into that quiet, unguarded state that she had first seen on the night of the snowstorm, and that she now understood to be the face of Clement Ashford feeling something completely. "You look beautiful," he said, and the two words were so simple and so direct and so entirely meant that she felt them go all the way down. The ceremony was short and real, the words of it exchanged in the warm May air with the apple blossoms moving in a light breeze, and the people who cared about them gathered close. Reverend Moss spoke the words with a sincerity that Alice had not always associated with him, and that she now found she was grateful for. When it came to the vows, Clement's voice was steady and his eyes on hers were constant, and she said her own vows clearly and without hesitation, meaning every syllable of them with the full weight of a woman who knows what she is saying and has thought carefully about all of it. They were married. Alice Ashford. She had not changed her name for a while, she told herself, because she needed to get used to it, but within a week she found that the name sat on her naturally and easily, like a garment made for her particular shape. The first year of the marriage was the most working year of Alice's life, which was saying something since she had never been a woman who avoided work. Together they brought in the best corn harvest the Wells, now Ashford, farm had produced in its history, and the oat crop came in solid as well. And by the end of summer they had paid the farmhand wages into a savings fund that Clement insisted on and purchased 2 additional mares for breeding, which was the first expansion of the farm's operations since Thomas's early optimistic years. They had the kinds of arguments that working people who spend all their time together inevitably have, about the placement of the new water trough, and the price being asked for seed corn from the Atwood catalog, and whether the north fence could survive another season or needed to be entirely replaced. And these arguments were real and sometimes heated and always resolved, because they were both people who valued resolution over victory. And because the farm was a shared project that they were both genuinely invested in, and you do not destroy what you are genuinely invested in over the placement of a water trough. In the evenings, she still read to him. They had worked through all of Middlemark and had moved on to other books, some sent from her sister in Cleveland and some ordered from the catalog, and this ritual of the evening reading by the fire, or, in summer, on the porch with the last light going gold over the flat horizon, became one of the deep pleasures of both their lives, the specific pleasure of a shared imaginative world at the end of a day of physical reality. She discovered things about him that surprised her and things that confirmed exactly what she had suspected. He was a man of genuinely strong feeling who had simply learned to be very careful about where he put those feelings, and once the carefulness became unnecessary between them, he was extraordinarily tender in ways that she found both moving and occasionally startling, because she had not expected it, and the unexpectedness of it kept it fresh. He brought her wildflowers for no reason on a Tuesday morning. He remembered the things she said in passing and acted on them weeks later, like the specific variety of apple she mentioned once in October, and that he somehow managed to find in the dry goods catalog an order for the following spring. He told her she was beautiful not constantly, but at intervals, at the moments when he meant it most acutely, and those moments had a quality to them that was entirely different from the reflexive affection of men who said it without thinking. She was also discovering things about the farm that her own competence and Thomas's good teaching had prepared her for, and that Clement's additional knowledge and strength were now expanding. The 60 acres were genuinely productive under both of them, in a way they had never quite been under only one, not because Thomas had been inadequate, but because farming at its heart was a partnership with the land, and with another person, and the land responded to the full engagement of two committed people. In the winter of 1879, Alice became pregnant. She knew it before she told him, in the way that women of her particular attentiveness to their own bodies tend to know things, and she sat with the knowledge for a week before she was ready to speak it, because it was enormous in ways that she needed to process privately first. It moved her in ways she had not anticipated. She had wanted children with Thomas, had thought it was coming, had been quietly grieved by the fact that it had not come in the 4 years of their marriage, and now it was coming, and it was coming with Clement, and she felt the bigness of this all the way through her. She told him on a December evening when the snow was falling softly outside, and the kitchen was warm, and they were sitting at the table after dinner with the lamp between them and a comfortable quiet around them that had become the texture of their life. She simply said it, looking at him, with the directness that was her way of bringing important things into the room. Clement looked at her for the full length of a beat in which she could see the news arriving and being received and understood, and then his face did something she had never seen it do, something entirely new, a kind of opening that was different from anything that had come before. And he got up from his chair and came around the table and took her face in both his large scarred hands and kissed her forehead, and then leaned his own forehead against hers, and she could feel that he was shaking slightly. The small, controlled trembling of a man in the grip of something too big for complete containment. "Alice," he said, and that was all. "I know," she said. They sat together like that for a long time in the lamplight with the snow outside, and everything changed around them, and between them in all the ways that this kind of news changes things. The pregnancy was not easy in the early months. She was sick in the mornings with a thoroughness that she had not been warned about, and there were weeks in January and February when getting out of bed required a level of determination that she normally reserved for significant agricultural challenges. Clement was a remarkable partner through this, not fussy or hovering, which she would not have borne, but practically capable and genuinely attentive in the ways that mattered. He took over the heavier outdoor work without comment and brought her dry biscuits in the morning before she was required to be vertical, and said nothing about any of it except once, when she apologized for the disruption, and he said, with a precision that stopped the apology in its tracks, "Alice, you are growing a person. I can handle the chickens." The sickness eased by March, and the spring came in again, and with it the plowing and the planting. And Alice worked the farm as she always had, but with adjustments, fewer of the heaviest tasks and more of the planning and accounting and garden work. And the baby moved in April for the first time, and she was standing in the kitchen garden with her hands in the dark soil when she felt it, and she stood up and put her hand on her abdomen and said something very quiet to no one in particular, and then went to find Clement, who was in the field, and walked up beside him and took his hand and placed it flat against her side and said, "There," and his expression did that opening thing again, and she loved him so fiercely in that moment that it made breathing briefly complicated. The baby came in the last week of August, 1880, on a hot afternoon when the plains were baked copper and yellow and the cicadas were making the air vibrate. The doctor from Caldwell, a solid, reliable woman named Dr. Frances Hilliard, who had come west from St. Louis 3 years earlier, and whose presence in the county Alice considered one of its most significant assets, presided over a long labor with calm competence, and delivered a healthy boy into the world and into Clement Ashford's shaking hands. Clement sat down very suddenly on the edge of the bed when Dr. Hilliard handed him the wrapped child, sat down as though his legs had simply made an executive decision without consulting the rest of him, and he held the baby and looked at him with an expression that Alice, watching from the pillow with her whole body wrung out and magnificently exhausted, would remember for the rest of her life. "Hello," Clement said to the baby very quietly, just that. "Hello." They named him Thomas James Ashford. Thomas for the man who had taken a stranger in from the cold on a winter road, whose kindness had set in motion the chain of events that ended here, in this room, with this new life. James for Clement's younger brother who had not come home from the war. The name sat right in a way that felt like something completed. Young Thomas, Tom as he became almost immediately, was a loud and vigorous infant with his mother's gray eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, and he grew into a loud and vigorous toddler with the specific physical fearlessness that Clement observed with a mixture of pride and genuine alarm, as the boy had a habit of attempting to climb things that were not designed to be climbed by people of his size and locomotion. Alice dealt with this with the equanimity of a woman who had always known that children were interesting, unpredictable, and ultimately their own separate beings. And the farm adapted itself around the presence of Tom, the way the land adapted itself around a new watercourse, with a certain inevitability. The farm expanded in the spring of 1881. Clement had been in conversation with Harlan Price through the winter, about 20 acres on the north side of the property, that Harlan had no particular use for, and that would significantly improve the Ashford farm's access to the creek. The negotiation was conducted with a thoroughness that satisfied both parties, and the purchase was made in April, and Alice stood at the new boundary line on a spring morning with Tom on her hip, and looked at the 80 acres of Kansas earth that was hers and Clement's, and felt something that she could only describe as a deep and settled rightness, the feeling of a life that had arrived at something true. Harlan, for his part, came over for supper after the papers were signed and ate 3 helpings of Alice's elk stew, and told Clement that the farm was looking finer than it ever had, which from Harlan was roughly equivalent to a formal award, and Clement accepted it with the grave simplicity that he brought to all genuine compliments. Diego came with Harlan that evening, and Alice had always liked Diego, the quietness of him and his unostentatious competence, and she had been thinking for some time about the situation of the Mexican workers in the county, of whom there were a growing number as the cattle industry expanded, and who were in many cases treated with a disregard that sat poorly with her. She had talked with Clement about it on more than one evening, and Clement, whose own experience of being the wrong side of a war had given him a particular sensitivity to the experience of people navigating a world that had not been built for them, had agreed with her views entirely. When Harlan mentioned that Diego was thinking of moving on, looking for more stable work, Alice offered Diego a position on the Ashford farm without hesitation, at fair wages, and with the same conditions she would offer any other worker, and Diego looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, and then accepted quietly, and he turned out to be one of the finest workers the farm ever had. The summer of 1881 was hot and productive, and contained within it many things that Alice would hold in her memory as bright and specific as coins. The way Tom learned to say Papa, which he rendered as a gleeful shout the first several hundred times he used it, as though delighted by the discovery that people had names for each other. The evening Clement built a proper porch swing, and they sat in it for the first time after Tom was asleep, her shoulder against his, with the late summer dark coming down slowly over the plains and the fireflies beginning their patient signaling in the grass, and neither of them saying anything for a long time because nothing needed to be said. The day a new family, the Molinas, settled in on the old Bechtold claim to the south, and Alice went over with a basket of cornbread and plum jam and introduced herself, and found in Carmen Molina a woman of intelligence and warmth, and a wry sense of humor that Alice immediately recognized as a kindred spirit, and the 2 women became genuine friends in the way that is rare and valuable, and that Alice had not realized she was missing until it arrived. In the autumn of 1881, Alice was pregnant again. This time the news arrived with less overwhelming bigness and more of a deep, warm satisfaction, the satisfaction of something expected and wanted coming at the right time. Clement received it with the same opening expression and the same quiet overwhelming of his carefully maintained composure, and Alice laughed at him for it, affectionately and with complete love, and he pulled her close and said something into her hair that she never quite heard clearly but that she understood completely. This pregnancy was different from the first, less difficult in the early months, more of a companion than an affliction. She worked through the winter and into the spring with the comfortable confidence of a woman in her second pregnancy on a farm she knew deeply. And the baby arrived in the late spring of 1882, another long labor and doctor. Hilliard's calm, competent presence and Clement's large hand around hers at the end of it. A daughter this time. A girl with dark eyes like her father, and a quality of absolute determined self-possession that was evident from the first hours of her life, and that caused Dr. Hilliard to observe, with the dryness of a woman who had seen a great many infants, that this one knew exactly where she was and what she intended to do about it. They named her Margaret Clara, Margaret for Alice's mother. Clara for no particular reason, except that when they held her and tried the name it fit in exactly the right way, and they both knew it immediately. Tom's reaction to his new sister was the specific fascinated wariness of a nearly 2-year-old encountering a being smaller than himself for the first time, and he circled the cradle for several days at a distance that suggested he was not entirely certain of its contents. Within a week, he had decided that Margaret was his particular project and took up a position of self-appointed guardianship that the household found both touching and occasionally problematic when it expressed itself as refusing to let anyone else hold her, including her parents, which required patient and consistent negotiation. The farm continued to grow in the years that followed, not extravagantly or recklessly, but with the solid, careful expansion of people who understood what they were building and why. They added a proper bunkroom with beds for 3 men and hired additional seasonal help for the harvests. They replaced the original farmhouse kitchen with an extended room that gave Alice the workspace she had always been negotiating around, with a real range and proper shelving, and enough room to have Carmen Molina and her family over for Sunday dinners without everyone sitting on each other. They put in an orchard on the south slope, a dozen apple trees and 6 plum trees and 2 pear trees, and Clement said when they planted them that they were making a promise to the future, which was the kind of thing he said sometimes, quietly and precisely, that Alice held in her heart for years. Thomas Wells's grave was tended with consistent care. Alice went once a month, sometimes with the children and sometimes alone, and she brought flowers from the garden in summer and simply sat with the grave in winter. And she talked to Thomas in the way she had begun to talk to him after that morning in March when she had said goodbye, the way you talk to someone who has earned the permanent right to your honest thought. She told him about the children and the farm and the orchard trees. She told him once about Clement, really told him the whole of it, and she sat for a long time after in the October grass with the wind in the cemetery trees and felt, with the absolute certainty that sometimes comes to people who pay attention, that she was forgiven for whatever she had not needed to be forgiven for in the first place. Clement knew she went. He never asked what she said. She loved him for that too. The autumn of 1884 brought a dry spell that threatened the oat crop, and a dispute with a land company out of Wichita that was attempting to establish a claim on a portion of the creek bed that crossed the eastern edge of the Ashford property. This latter problem was the more serious one, and Clement rode to Wichita and spent 4 days with a lawyer there, a Mr. Solomon Greenberg, who was one of the shrewdest legal minds in the territory, and who had no particular patience with the methods that land companies tended to employ. The case was resolved in the Ashford farm's favor by the end of November, and Clement came home from the resolution with a settled satisfaction, and a bottle of good whiskey from Wichita that he and Alice and Diego and the Molinas opened at the kitchen table, and that produced one of the best evenings Alice could remember. All of them talking and laughing with the kind of ease and warmth that comes from people who have chosen each other and have been proven right by the choosing. Tom started school in Caldwell in the fall of 1885, and came home on the first day with a bruised lip from a fight on the schoolyard, and a detailed account of the fight that made it clear that he had defended a smaller boy against the bullying of two older ones, and had given considerably better than he received. Clement heard this account and sat with it for a moment, and then said to Tom, with great seriousness, that fighting was rarely the best solution, and that the best men he had known used their words first and held their fists as a last resort. Tom absorbed this with the gravity of a child receiving important information. Then Clement said that, when the last resort was genuinely the last resort, it was important to know how to use your fists properly, and offered to show him. And the look on Tom's face was a kind of incandescent happiness that Alice observed from the kitchen doorway with her arms folded, and the best version of a disapproving expression she could manage, which was not a very convincing disapproving expression, and Clement knew it. Margaret, at 3, had developed into exactly the self-possessed, determined person that Dr. Hilliard had identified in her first hours of life. She had opinions about everything, forcefully stated, and a quality of focused concentration when she was interested in something that Clement recognized as his own, and that Alice recognized as potentially limitless in what it might produce if it was properly directed. She had decided that the horses were her particular domain, and had learned their names and their individual characters with a thoroughness that made even Diego, who knew horses exceptionally well, take notice. One evening in the late summer of 1885, Alice and Clement sat on the porch swing after the children were in bed, as they often did when the day was done and the evening was good. The plains were going golden in the last light, and the orchard trees on the south slope were heavy with their second real bearing year, the apples filling out red and round, and the farm lay around them in the particular evening hush of late August, when everything that was going to happen that day has happened, and the night has not yet begun to ask anything of anyone. Alice leaned her head on Clement's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the swing that he had built and felt the slow motion of it and the warm Kansas air, and the sound of the tree frogs beginning in the grass by the creek. "Are you happy?" she asked, not because she doubted the answer, because she liked to hear it, and because she believed in the importance of asking rather than assuming. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was giving something genuine consideration rather than a ready-made answer. "I think happy is almost not a large enough word," he said. "I think I feel something that happy does not quite cover." He paused. "I feel placed, like something that was a long time looking for where it belonged has found the exact right spot and set down roots." Alice thought about this and found it precisely right, the image of it, roots going down into the dark Kansas earth holding. "I feel that too," she said. The swing moved. The evening deepened. The farm was quiet and full of life around them, the horses in the barn and the children asleep, and the orchard heavy with apples, and the 80 acres of good land holding all of it in its flat embrace. She thought about the cemetery on the hill east of town and the October day 6 years ago, and the hollow feeling and the iron gate, and the turn of her head that had shown her a stranger standing alone over a grave with his hat in his hands. And she thought about the series of moments that followed, all the way here, to this porch swing on this August evening with this man's arm around her, and his steady heartbeat under her cheek, and the whole good substantial weight of the life they had made. It struck her, as it had struck her before, that the whole thing had pivoted on a detail as small as a glance back over a shoulder, as a woman almost at the gate turning to look one more time at the thing she was leaving behind, and finding instead something that would become the best thing she ever walked toward. She turned her face up to Clement's, and he looked down at her with the dark eyes that she knew as well as she knew anything in her world, and there was in them what had always been in them. The directness and the steadiness and the depth of feeling he had always kept careful, and that was now fully and permanently hers. And she reached up and put her palm against his jaw, and he turned his face into her hand like a man who had always been cold, and had found warmth and knew exactly what he had found. "I love you," she said, the plainest and most complete statement she knew. "I love you," he said back, just as plainly, just as completely. The evening star appeared on the western horizon, precise and brilliant against the fading blue, and the farm received the night with the patience of things that are rooted and whole and fully, thoroughly, permanently at peace. In the years that came after, the Ashford farm became something that people in Caldwell and the surrounding county pointed to as an example of what the plains could be when the right people put their full attention to it. The orchard produced reliably, and Alice began putting up preserves and apple butter in commercial quantities, and selling them through Atwood's store and eventually through 2 stores in Wichita, which brought in a supplemental income that funded Tom's schooling when he was old enough to go to the Caldwell Academy, and later Margaret's fierce and thorough education at the same institution, where she proved to be the best student of her year, by a margin that her teachers found both impressive and occasionally challenging to accommodate. Diego worked the Ashford farm for 11 years and then bought his own small piece of land to the west of Caldwell with the savings he had accumulated, and Alice and Clement attended the small celebration of that purchase, as they attended all the significant moments of people they cared about, with genuine warmth and good food, and the quiet acknowledgement that his prosperity was also theirs, because the boundary between their well-being had never been one they drew very carefully. Harlan Price died in 1887, and Alice attended the funeral with Clement and stood at the graveside and thought about funerals and what they meant and what happened after them. And she found herself, in the middle of the ceremony, putting her hand into Clement's hand without thinking about it, and he closed his fingers around hers, and she stood there in the October cemetery on the hill east of town where everything had started and felt, very precisely, the full circuit of what had been, what was, and what was still to come. Tom grew into a steady, serious young man with his father's work ethic and his mother's quiet wit, and a quality of his own that neither of them had predicted, which was a gift for music, a gift that expressed itself through a fiddle he had acquired from a traveling musician who came through Caldwell in 1888, and that he played in the evenings on the porch with a skill that grew year by year into something genuinely moving. The sound of it became part of the fabric of the farm's evenings, part of what Alice would hear in her mind forever when she thought of those years, that light, clear fiddle music going out over the darkening plains, while the stars came out one by one. Margaret, at 16, had decided that she intended to study medicine, which caused a range of responses in the community, from enthusiastic support from Dr. Hilliard, who had been watching Margaret's mind develop for 15 years and was not the least bit surprised, to the polite skepticism of those who had not yet caught up to the idea. Alice and Clement's response was to write letters to the relevant institutions in Kansas City and St. Louis, and to sit down with Margaret and work through the financial planning for it with the same thorough care they brought to everything. And the conversation was the kind of conversation you have with a child when you realize they are no longer a child, but a person with their own distinct and serious trajectory. And it was one of the most satisfying conversations of Alice's life. In the autumn of 1889, on a day that had the particular quality of certain October days in Kansas when the light is simultaneously warm and clear, and already carrying the suggestion of loss that autumn always contains, Alice stood at the farmhouse window and watched Clement come across the yard from the barn, moving with the same unhurried, long-strided ease that she had watched now for 11 years, and that still had the power to do something to her chest, and she thought about all of it. The whole arc of it, from the hollow day at the grave to this full and abundant life, and she felt the kind of gratitude that is not the manageable, grateful feeling of ordinary moments, but the deep, still, enormous gratitude of a person who has arrived somewhere completely real and knows it. He came through the door and found her standing at the window and stopped. He always noticed her, was the thing. In 11 years he had never walked into a room and failed to notice her in it, and this specific form of attention, so consistent and so unforced, was one of the things she loved about him most. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "You, the light." She turned from the window. "Come have coffee." He came and sat at the table where he had sat through 1,000 evenings, and she brought the pot and the cups and sat across from him, and they looked at each other in the afternoon light of the kitchen with the window behind him showing the farm and the sky and the last of the summer's sunflowers along the fence going brown-headed and finished. And it was an ordinary moment of an ordinary day, and it was also, as ordinary moments sometimes are when you are paying full attention, everything. "Diego came by," he said. "He wants to know if we'll be coming to the harvest supper." "Of course we will," she said. "Tom can bring his fiddle." Clement smiled. It was the real smile, the one that used the whole of his face, the one she had been watching develop for 11 years from that first reluctant suggestion of itself in the cemetery into this full-grown thing that she loved without qualification or reserve. "He will not need much encouragement," Clement said. "No," Alice said. "He will not." She put both hands around her coffee cup and felt the warmth of it. Outside the kitchen window the plains went on to the horizon, in the way they always had, flat and enormous and honest, the kind of landscape that does not hide anything and asks the same of the people who live on it. And Alice and Clement sat together in their kitchen on their farm on their 80 acres of Kansas earth, and drank their coffee in the way of people who have all the time in the world and know how to use it, and who have found, in the particular company of one another, the thing that makes time worth spending. The harvest supper was a good one. The fiddle played under the stars. The children of the county ran through the lamplight with the energy of the young and the unconcerned. Carmen Molina brought her famous chili, and a chocolate cake that Tom ate more of than was strictly reasonable. Dr. Hilliard came and sat with Margaret in a corner, and talked with great animation about something that caused Margaret's eyes to go bright and focused in her characteristic way, and Alice watched this from across the firelit yard, and felt the pleasure of it settle in her like grain into a good barrel. Clement found her there, and stood beside her, and followed her gaze to where Margaret was talking. "She is going to do it," he said. "Study medicine, I can see it already." "She is going to do more than that," Alice said. "She is going to be extraordinary." He put his arm around her in the October night, warm and steady and entirely hers, and she leaned against him and looked up at the Kansas stars that she had been looking at for 15 years now, that she had learned the names of from a book in her first winter here, and that she had been pointing out to her children since Tom could sit up and pay attention. And she thought, as she sometimes thought when she was very full of the life she was in, about the young woman she had been when she first arrived in this wide, strange country, the Ohio girl with her trunk and her uncertainty and her love for a solid, good man. And she thought about all the versions of herself between that girl and this woman, all the grief and the work and the joy and the difficulty and the grace of it. And she felt the whole shape of her life in that moment the way you sometimes feel a thing when you are in the middle of it and can somehow see it whole. And what she felt was this. It was a good life. It was a full and real and honest life. It had cost things and given things, and it had brought her here, to this farm and these children and this man. And here was exactly where she was meant to be. Clement pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she closed her eyes and the fiddle played, and the Kansas night received them both into its enormous dark and held them there, placed and rooted and entirely, unambiguously at home.